My story about how I got involved in storytelling is twofold. The more literal kind of how I got involved professionally in storytelling was years ago. I used to work in a day camp, kind of after school recreation setting, and I was over a center, and we would always tell the kids stories, as you do, read them books. And so I had read so many books, and oftentimes young children want you to read the same stories to them. And so there was a time that I remember this particular day that I'm like, you know what? I know this story. I tossed the book over my shoulder and I just started telling them the story. And then I noticed something almost magical happen. It was like they were looking at me, I was looking at them, they were smiling. It was like, this is amazing. It was a totally different dynamic than just reading a story. And so from that time, I began to work on stories and just telling them things and involving them. And then as time went on, I started including other aspects of it. I have a background in theater. I'd done some mime. Later on, I learned some music and added that to it. And then I realized that there was this whole storytelling world, that there was national festivals and local festivals and small storytelling swap groups. And I didn't know that. I didn't know I thought I was the only one. And it was just amazing about how that evolved. So the first time I got involved is professionally, was after I'd been doing it for my center. Then a few other centers say, hey, could you come and tell us the story to my kids? This is all within the same organization. I got a phone call from someone who had got a grant to hire a storyteller to tell stories about diversity. And actually my brother worked for this organization, and he told them about me. And so that's how they called me. And they hired me. I tried out, told them a story, and that was probably almost 20 years ago. It was an agency called Fair Housing of Marin, and they're still there. And I still have a relationship with them. I still do stories from time to time for them. But that was kind of how I got involved professionally. Now, the real story of how I became a storyteller was when I was in the 4th grade. Miss Majors, my teacher, assigned us a project to create a game. And it was one of those, in the 4th grade, you do the more long-term papers, not the little sentences or paragraphs. So this was gonna be like a project. We had to write a narrative about the story. We had to create it, whether it was an outdoor game, indoor game, actually literally create it, gather supplies, put it together, bring it to class, and actually do a demonstration of the story. So it was really pretty involved, maybe 5, 6 steps. And then to make it even more exciting, she was gonna have the kids vote on the best one. 4th graders, competitive. 4th grader, procrastinator. Didn't do it, didn't even every time she brought up in class, oh, you guys should be at this step, you should be doing this by now. Just put it off. I figured it would go away. You know how sometimes kids figure if they don't think about it, don't speak it into existence, it does not exist. Well, it did exist, and the day it was due, 2 weeks later, I see parents coming with boxes and cones and painted objects. I was like, whoa. That's when I realized I was in trouble and I should have done this project. So the only advantage I had going for me is my name is Kirk Waller. W's, end of the alphabet. So she went through everybody, then she said, okay, Kirk, what do you got? So I left it at home. That was my best opening line. And she, being a great 4th grade teacher, said, oh, that's fine. You could bring it tomorrow. Just stand up and tell us about your project today. Give us an idea. Well, it was a board game about galactic empires conquer the earth. And there, at that moment, I became a storyteller. And I started making up this idea about, I was covered in foil, and I got the little game Parcheesi pieces and covered them in foil, and I took paper towel rolls, toilet paper rolls, and covered them in foil, and I made a spinner out of a paper clip, and I explained it, and I got so involved in this explanation that when it was finished, the kids clapped, and they voted. I'm not kidding, I won first prize. Now, I have to tell you, the addendum, this is like the cautionary tale. I did not get a grade on that. She did catch me out, and she did kind of the next day, she pulled me to the side. But she was such a wonderful teacher. A couple months later, she invited me and a few children to audition for a play, The Wizard of Oz, up at Cal State University Hayward at the time. It's East Bay now. And I got in the part. So she, instead of scolding me, which she had every right to do, she channeled that creativity into something positive. And I actually really credit her for getting me involved in theater and performance and storytelling from that unfortunate incident.
What do you think storytelling does for people, the listeners and the storytellers?
That's a good question. I think the big thing that I think storytelling is safe. It's a safe way to explore your emotions, in a sense. I think that's one thing that really, for me, that I found, that there are principles, there's archetypes, there's these things that have gone back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years in stories. That's why they remain. That's why they survive. And they're things that we all relate to, you know, fear and death and life, you know, and belonging and love. There was one storyteller who said that, see if I can remember what she said. She said she believes stories are about two things: love, and I think the other one was belonging, but I know love was one. But she said they really boiled down to, basically what her point was, they boiled down to the essence of the things that are important in us, you know, to us. You know, love, fear, those things that we all feel. And I think stories and storytelling offers an avenue to explore that safely. One of the stories that I do, that you heard me do today, the Cowtail Switch, for me is a perfect example, because it's really it's a folktale. It's interesting, it's different, it's kind of exotic, it's unique, it has some fun parts in it, but it's really a story about a hunter who dies, and the people forgot about him after a while. And then in the story, he's brought back to life by some amazing magic, but the point is that we can't forget them. The magic is telling stories and keeping them alive through that way. And that story is a great example for me of exploring when my wife died. I actually told that story before I was able to tell her story. Because while I'm telling it, I'm feeling it. You know, while I'm telling it, I'm driven to keep, you know, stories alive and to keep the ancestors alive and to keep her alive. And then I was able to build a bridge to actually create and develop a story about her. And so it was a safe way to explore that. And so for me, even fun, silly folk tales have some really serious things. Brer Rabbit stories, which to me are the most fun, whimsical stories, they explore some of the most common elements in our life, you know, survival. That's really what Brer Rabbit stories are about to me, is he figures out a way to survive. Not right, not wrong, just to make it. And so for me, stories are really a great way to just explore those common things that we all have.
What advice would you give to new storytellers?
I think one of the biggest things that I could tell if anyone just wants to start telling, or they're new, or they're just young and getting going, is to sound super deep. It's really complicated. Is to tell stories and keep telling them. And don't wait forever to tell them in front of someone else. Like, you know, work on them, get a good sense of them, and start telling. I remember meeting someone at the end of a festival and was asking me, how do you know all those stories? I said, well, just practice them. She said, well, I practice stories, but I got to tell them at least 100 times before I feel good enough to perform them. And she meant that literally 100 times. And I said, don't do that. Don't do that. I never tell people what they should and shouldn't do. I told them, don't do that. Because you want to get the story out. And I think that's the more you get it out, and you get it out into the air and open, you'll hear it and feel it, and the audience will respond or not respond. And I think that's the best way to kind of fine-tune a story and help work on it. So just tell it, tell it, tell it. One thing that I think is just beautiful and amazing, that like the instruments that I brought today, particularly the ngoni and the balafon, they go back to the 13th and 12th century. And that to think that, and that's where actually griots, the word griot, that's where the first griots were kind of associated with that in that same time period, the 12th century Mali type, about somewhere around there. And the fact that they have kept their culture alive, and through storytelling, oral tradition, is amazing to think that it goes back that many hundreds of years, and I'm still telling those stories today. There's a story, a musical that's around Shenyang, that you see in a lot of billboards around now. It's a Chinese folk tale that is like I don't know if it's 1,000 years old, but it's like hundreds of years old. And that history, that power, I think goes back to that other question too about, what's important about storytelling is because those things I think are so universal, that it allows these African stories and Asian stories and European stories to survive through time. And one thing I think is important, it's interesting when I'll go to festivals or especially schools, is people feel, well, storytelling it's a lost art, which I don't really feel I don't agree it's a lost art, because we tell stories every single day. But as an art form, what they're saying is, things are getting so fast paced and so digital and so physical, I think, with it, everything has to be, in your hands and available at the press of a button, is that storytelling still keeps that raw human power and is able to capture that and pass that along. And I don't know if money or anything can put a value on that. I didn't tell a story today, but there's a few stories that are kind of considered slave tales. And even the Brer Rabbit is kind of in that tradition, but they're stories that on the surface, they just seem almost whimsical and fun, and people still like them today for that reason. But below the surface, there's so much strength and hope and resilience in them, especially like the Brer Rabbit type of stories. So there's a story by Virginia Hamilton, not by her, but she has captured it and retold it. It's called Big Wolf and Little Daughter, and there's another version of it that I think you'll find in the library, Virginia Hamilton. But anyway, it's a story about a little black girl, who lives out in the woods with her papa, and he tells her don't go outside the gate because there's wolves outside the gate. So eventually he goes away, she goes outside the gate, a wolf comes, and she sings this song to kind of mesmerize the wolf and eventually make her way back home. That's like the 30-second version. But that story, even though it's really interesting and fun and musical, it's really about using your wits to overpower someone who's stronger than you, who may be the oppressor. And so there's all these layers of meanings, which I think, not only in the folk stories, but a lot of the songs as well, that carry those messages that help create strength and hope and resilience, which I think, is awesome. Some of my favorites. Okay, there's three and it's interesting enough, they're national tellers, international tellers, but all three of them are from California. One is Willie Claflin, which you haven't read. I'm sure you must have ran into him at some time. But Willie Claflin is just a great influence. He tells personal stories, folk stories. He plays instruments. He's incredibly funny, but he's also incredibly moving as well. And he has a great knowledge of folklore. Diane Ferlat has been probably the most singular influence on my storytelling. I mean, she's from Southern California, but she's been telling stories probably on a professional level for 40 years or so, and she is still going strong, and she is amazing. And then the last one is Bill Harley. He is I think he's the only storyteller who has won a Grammy for spoken word. And I don't even think they do that category anymore, so he will hold that mantle forever. And his claim to fame, I think, was he did a lot of children's music and children's songs and stuff around, but he tells to adults, he plays. He was actually one of the ones who influenced me. He was one of the first storytellers I saw that played music and told stories, which I thought was, because for years I just seen storytellers, which were great, but then he brought that level of music, which takes it to a whole nother, side of your brain and a whole nother kind of texture. And so he was a big influence in that, and they're all people that I know and that are accessible. They're just, generous with their knowledge and their time, but they're amazing storytellers as well. I have a question that I'd like to answer. I don't know if I know the answer to it, but it's something I thought of, is where is storytelling going?
What was my next question?
I think it's interesting. I don't know, I'm not a historian of storytelling, but I know, some 30, 40 years ago or so, there was this storytelling renaissance in the United States, and that's when the festivals became really big. That's when the national festival just kind of took off. And I think that part may not be as strong, but it has kind of evolved into this, the Moth and the Front Porch, the type of more personal storytelling, and that appeals more towards a younger group, maybe young adult type of age as well. And so in my opinion, I really believe that it's going to kind of blend the two together, because there's a few festivals that actually do that. They'll include some of the traditional stories as well as invite the younger, moth type of, storytellers. The festival that we met at, actually, it was a guy from that told stories at the Moth, and he's a Grand Slam winner. And then you have, Gay Ducey, has been around forever telling traditional stories and personal stories. And so I think that it's going to be a blending, because I think you cannot get rid of the traditional tales for the reasons we talked about. Those are the things that keep going strong. Personal stories, I think, are what grab us and connect us. I think the traditional stories are what keep stories alive, and I think you have to have both of them, because even the younger group the younger generations that may not on one level feel as interested in the traditional older stories, they're about the same stuff. They're about the exact same stuff, they're just told in a different context, right? They're about love, they're about hate, they're about fear, they're about oppression, they're about all these themes. So I really hope, at least, but I believe that that's where the future is going. I don't mean that the stories will be blended, but that you'll have both that are accepted. It won't feel like it's two camps, like it sort of kind of does now, but it'll be more of a blending and hopefully an embracing of storytelling, period. Because I can't imagine it going anywhere, even as our digital age gets more and more advanced. I think stories will be there because they're in our DNA. We can't survive without telling our story. I remember the first time I went to the National Storytelling Festival. I don't know if it was the first time, but it was one of the times I went, and Catherine Wyndham, which is like, the storyteller. I was amazed because there's this little old white lady from Alabama, just super unassuming, tiny frame. I'm like, and I'm like, I'm energetic, I'm more theatrical, I play music, and that's the kind of stories I like. And I'm like, what's the big deal? What's she gonna do, right? And she gets up there, she stands behind the mic in the most unassuming, no frills, just starts telling a story in her sweet Southern accent about back home in Alabama, and you could literally hear a pin drop. 1,500 people were in this particular venue. I stopped and I heard a cricket chirping outside the tent, and I am not being symbolic. You literally heard the cricket chirping. It was that quiet. And so, but it's like you said, is once she, excuse me, sorry, I'm gonna sit back down. But when she started telling her stories, have a way of taking walls down, because you're hearing their heart. You're hearing their stories about home, about growing up, about their own struggles and survivals and triumphs and failures. And I think that's a beautiful thing. That's why even companies have went the way of more storytelling than fact-based training and presentation. I mean, people want to hear their story. They don't want to hear a bullet point fact. And I think it's that same element. Stories have a way of taking the walls down. They have a way of making, in their eyes, the customers relate, as opposed to, just think they're going to buy some shiny object. But when I hear your story, I'm more open to you. One thing I love is, like, I don't know if you overheard the lady that came up at the end, but she got teary-eyed, just saying, I just love your stories. And I just felt when you were telling stories, there's like this light around you, and I don't think you were up there alone. And in other words, she connected, she related, and they're universal. I told a story about my late wife. I told it at a theater in LA, and at the time, this is years ago, and I was a good 6, 7, 8 years younger than I am now. And this old lady, maybe 70s, maybe 80s, came up to me. And my story was called My Angel. This is kind of it was a story about her being kind of like my angel. But this lady came up to me and said, my husband died just a year or so ago, and that's what he called me, his angel. And with tears in her eyes, we just hugged, because two totally different generations, different races, from different parts of the country, related. We connected through the story. Mine was my angel, hers was an angel, somebody else's was some other word for it, but we all have that loss or that thing or that person, that we can connect through. And can't say enough about that.
get goosebumps on the first story, about the finding the bones.
Yeah. Yes, and why? So that's right. That's the question. It's different for you than it will be for somebody else, and that's, to me, that's why how stories rise to the same level as what we consider, other great forms of art, is because you connect in one way, somebody else connects in another way. If I asked what's this story about, you get a couple of different answers, which I think is the beauty of it, and that's the way it should be. Not that, no, it's about this. No, it's about that to you, and I'm glad that you connected, but to them, they got this totally different thing out of it, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
Well, I better stop or I'll talk all day.